Thank you, and like the others, let me say what a splendid occasion this is, what a hugely impressive panel we've had, and an even more impressive audience. To see so many of you here is truly, truly remarkable. I just wanted to say that since this is a book launch, let me start by talking about the book. It really is an excellent work of scholarship. We haven't mentioned that. At the same time, it's readable, it's well organized, rich in data, there are tables, there's statistics, there's a lot that you can find to buttress every argument you may want to make, and there are cogent arguments, which actually survey the entire available literature on Indian Muslims, minus the one book that Manoj Jha pointed out by his student, and at the same time goes back to the past and looks to the future. So it's a pretty comprehensive volume, and if one only has the time to read one book on the predicament of Indian Muslims in an academic and scholarly manner, I would say this is very clearly it. So Mujibur Rahman sees this as a sort of third historic political moment in the history of India's Muslims. 1857 is the first. You have the essential extinction of what you might think of as Muslim rule in the subcontinent, though he himself argues Muslim rule wasn't just Muslim rule and wasn't only Muslim rule. That's a different conversation. That was the first moment. The second was 1947, partition, seemingly the triumph of a certain kind of Muslim political movement, but with consequences for the subcontinent and particularly for India's Muslims who were left behind. And now this is the third moment with the rise of Hindutva. Now, I've got a few scattered observations because to talk about the book comprehensively would take too long, and you've already been very patient with all of us. One observation is, of course, we sometimes forget in looking at these different periods that Muslims were always a minority in the subcontinent. At no point in our history were Muslims ever a majority here. But when the Mughal Empire, for example, was at its zenith, did Muslim Indians have a minority complex? Was there any concern about their minorityhood, as it were? So it's also a question of a state of mind and a social condition, not just a numerical one. And what we've seen in the course of the last quarter of a century, maybe 30 years, has been a steady increase in the minoritization of the Indian Muslim in ways that, particularly across northern India, seem to have acquired a certain sense of being absolutely the otherization of an entire community by the dominant majority. And with all of this, there is absolutely no doubt that the last 10 years of BJP rule under Narendra Modi's government has marked a certain culmination of this process, where for the first time in the history of independent India, we have a government in power whose ruling party does not have a single Muslim MP in either the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha, and neither does it have a single MLA or MLC in any of the legislative assemblies of our country. So there is almost not even a pretense anymore of seeking to represent all Indians. It is quite simply a party of majoritarianism that is saying to the Muslims, this is your place and it's not inside the room. Now, yet I would argue that there is a case to be made to disagree with Manoj when he argues that India was never secular. I would say that when we talk about it being an individual Nehruvian project, perhaps yes, but the intellectual fecundity of the Nehruvian idea was that he had a conception of Indian civilization. Asad, come. He had a conception of Indian civilization and history that was inclusive, that saw India as this kind of palimpsest where everybody had written, everybody had contributed, and all those who had contributed had actually played a part in shaping the Indian identity. So for him, Muslims and Islam were as much an indispensable part of the warp and web of the Indian tapestry as any other identity. And that conception was fundamental to the Nehruvian idea. I think secular may well have been the word that appealed to him. It probably was not literally the right word, because secularism, if you look up any dictionary, involves distancing from religion, whereas in fact the secularism practiced in Nehruvian India and beyond and since has been a religion, has been an ethos which has witnessed the proliferation of religions, the state supporting all of them, but not, at least till now, favoring any particular one. Now, the issue here, of course, is that this civilizational history that Nehru saw is shared by many others. And that's why, for many people like me and others like me, there is a fundamental disagreement about the nature of what Indian civilization is all about, how Indian culture has been formed. And let's never forget that when partition came about, the fundamental issue that divided the nation, remember that at that time of partition, we had a number of other partitions in the next 5 years. There was North and South Korea, North and South Vietnam, East and West Germany. But in all of those, the fault lines were ideological. It was communists on the one side, capitalists on the other. Geography helped as well. But we didn't have geography. There was no North and South partition. There was, at the same time, no ideological difference. The fundamental issue was on one question. Is religion the determinant of your nationhood? And those who said it was, founded a country for the people of their religion. That was Pakistan. And what remained was therefore by default, what you might call secular, a country that rejected the notion that religion alone could determine your nationhood. That is the fundamental distinction between, if you like, the Nehruvian conception of Indian secularism and that which is also embodied in the constitution that Dr. Ambedkar gave us, which explicitly in articles, 19 to 25, gives us the entire panoply of rights: freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, freedom of religion, freedom of propagation of religion, all of which collectively give everyone the right to feel secure in their religious identity in India, whatever that identity may be. Now that fundamental difference is where, as I say, I would disagree with Manoj. But the book, I believe, tackles this whole range of issues extremely well. The only thing is, in the chapter on southern India, which, by the way, is a very welcome addition to this book, because I've often found, living here in Delhi, that there is a very North Indian centered view of all of these issues. The experience of South India and of South Indian Muslims has largely been neglected. Mujib tries to do justice to it. I would slightly be critical and say he is insufficiently doing justice to the experience of Kerala, because Kerala's history was so very different. We were a trading land open to the rest of the world. Islam did not come by the sword, as some in the north have experienced it. It came through traders who had been trading with what is today Kerala for 1,000 years before the birth of the Prophet. And these people who used to come when the winds were favorable across the Arabian Sea, stay in Kerala for months and then go back when the winds turned, these people brought the news of Islam literally as news that they were sharing with familiar friends in Kerala. They said, you know what's happening in our part of the world? There is this prophet, this is his message. And this so intrigued some people that one of our local Rajas, Cheruman Perumal, said, I'm going to go and meet this prophet. How interesting. And he got onto a ship and went off, actually, to the Arabian Peninsula. He never made it back. But the proof of his successful voyage to go and meet the prophet in the prophet's lifetime can still be seen today in the country of Oman, south of Salalah. There are Kerala coconut trees growing, which are not native to the Arabian Peninsula, but which he had taken with him on his ship to supply himself with coconut water on his way to meet the Prophet. There are similar stories throughout in Kerala of how, for example, when there was a sufficient number of Muslim worshippers, they went to the local king and said, we need a place to worship. And the king said, fine, there's a disused temple here that no one's using, why don't you have that? And the oldest mosque outside the Arabian Peninsula is this mosque, Kodungalur, which began life as a temple. There's still a gigantic brass lamp right in front of it. And even though the mosque has gone through a dozen renovations in the last 1400 years, and now it even features digital LED displays of namaz timings, the fact is, Mujib, you don't even mention this mosque in the story. Or the Zamorin of Calicut, who was so impressed with the seafaring prowess of the Muslim Kunjali Marikars that he actually decreed for several years that every fisherman in his family had to bring up one child as a Muslim because he was convinced only Muslims could sail properly. These are the kinds of stories that meant that in Kerala, I would argue that the minorities, whether Muslim or Christian, don't have a sense of being a minority. They feel as much a sense as stakeholders and owners of the place as anybody else. And that difference is slightly missing in this analysis. And I would argue too, as one or two others have done, that perhaps you've been too pessimistic, Mujib. Your narrative appears to assume the continued dominance of the Hindutva majoritarian argument. But as others have pointed out, the 24 elections have given some pause to that. I think you've been too dismissive of Shaheen Bagh. I take Salman's point that those who were in Shaheen Bagh have not done very well since. I speak as I believe the first MP to have actually gone and addressed the grandmothers of Shaheen Bagh in the second week of December. And I have to say that one of the most exciting and important things about that was that the protesters were not just Muslim. It may have begun as that, but throughout the country, in very many different parts of the country, and I myself inaugurated 7 different protest meetings in Kerala alone in the months of December and January. The people there were from all faiths, because what was at stake was this very notion of Indianness. It was not so much a question, after all, who wrote Kagaz Nahi Dikhayenge? It wasn't a Muslim who wasn't going to show his Kagaz, right? It was a poet from the so-called majority community. But there was a sense of identification that this cause was a cause for every Indian and not just for the Muslims. I believe that the citizenship principle is what is at stake there, and Shaheen Bagh's lasting value is that it put that front and center in this debate. It is about your rights as citizens of India, and that, if abridged for one section of people, is a threat to everybody. And that is the key principle. Yes, COVID saved the government. Shaheen Bagh finished only because when COVID happened and the entire nation was locked down, Shaheen Bagh could be dismantled. We should not forget that till that very moment, not only was Shaheen Bagh actually alive and kicking and protesting on a daily basis, and people were coming in, there were Sikhs setting up langars there to feed the protesters and all of that, but in every city, every major city across India, and in some not so major cities in my state of Kerala, there were protesters of all backgrounds, echoing the demands of the people of Shaheen Bagh right up to the declaration of the COVID lockdown. I'll conclude with a reference that Mujib himself makes in the concluding chapter to Martin Luther King's famous comment that there is no solution through isolation. And that ultimately would be my appeal and my advice at the same time to my Muslim brothers and sisters. Do not, in the process of articulating the shikwa, understanding the problems that Mujib has so ably delineated, do not isolate yourselves from the rest of the Indian mainstream. There are plenty of us with you. Secular India, whether you like the term or not, or pluralist India, inclusive India, that India is real. You are not alone. There are very, very many of us who are determined to stand with you. And I would even go further and say, as this fight moves on, do not fight for yourselves as Muslims, fight for yourselves as Indians, because it's your rights as Indians that we are all here to defend and protect in defending the secular ideals that this Constitution we are all cherishing gave us. So once again, congratulations, Mujibur Rahman, on an excellent book, and my very, very best wishes for its success. Jai Hind.